Now, from Washington, D.C., Raymond Arroyo.
Welcome to The World Over Live. I want to thank you all for joining us in the United States and internationally. Delighted you decided to be with us. The Pope this week offered his State of the World address, where he gave particular attention to religious freedom and the ongoing Christian persecution in hotspots around the world. Now, there also continue to be places where people of faith are encountering attacks. The Pope even offered insights on the difficulties he sees in the Western world. Here to give us an update on the struggle for religious liberty around the globe is Director of the Center for Religious Freedom at the Hudson Institute, SHEA. And later, Planned Parenthood released its annual report this week showing a startling increase in the number of abortions it provided last year. Tonight, we'll talk with a member of the U.S. House of Representatives who's attempting to strip the organization of its federal funding. Congresswoman DIANE BLACK of Tennessee will join us. As always, I want you to be part of the program, so get your calls in now. The number, 1-800-221-9460 in the U.S., and internationally, 205-271-2980, or drop us an email at worldover@ewtn.com. Let's get things started. Here's the brief. News from the world over this week. In Rome, a top Vatican cardinal says Blessed John Paul II could be declared a saint as soon as this year. Cardinal Giovanni Battista Re, retired prefect of the Congregation for Bishops, told ANSA News Service that 3 of the 4 miracles attributed to the intercession of the beloved Pope are currently being studied. A second confirmed miracle is necessary for canonization. Cardinal Re predicted, if not this year, it'll be 2014. We'll keep you posted. And the bishops of Venezuela have voiced their concern over its country's postponed presidential inauguration. President Hugo Chavez was supposed to be sworn in on Thursday, as required by the Venezuelan Constitution. But he's reportedly laid up in a Cuban hospital recovering from a 4th surgery for cancer. Chavez has not been seen in public for a month. This has created a bit of a constitutional crisis. The bishops, as well as the opposition party, have warned that the postponement and politicization of the swearing-in could destabilize the country. The bishops further rued the government's secrecy surrounding the health of Chavez. On Wednesday, the country's Supreme Court ruled that the inauguration could be postponed indefinitely as Chavez convalesces, per the request of Chavez's hand-picked successor, Vice President Nicolas Maduro. The court also rejected calls for a team of doctors to be sent to Cuba to report on the health of Chavez. And the controversy over same-sex marriage is making headlines on several fronts this week. French President François Hollande is urging Catholic schools not to discuss the government's push to legalize same-sex marriage with students in those institutions. France's education minister made similar comments, saying that Catholic schools which are under contract to the state should respect the principle of neutrality and the freedom of conscience for all. He's also asked that local officials report any, quote, anti-gay views being aired at Catholic schools. In recent weeks and months, the bishops of France and Pope Benedict have voiced their opposition to the socialist government's push for gay marriage legislation. And the Church of England has announced that clergy who are registered in same-sex partnerships can become bishops so long as they agree to abstain from sexual activity. The decision by the House of Bishops, one of the 3 branches which govern the Church of England, is an extension of a 2005 rule that allowed homosexual men in civil partnerships to be ordained to the Anglican priesthood. And in Washington, D.C., the storied National Cathedral announced that it will begin celebrating same-sex weddings. The Episcopal-run cathedral has hosted several presidential inaugural prayer services and funerals. The cathedral will be one of the first Episcopalian churches to conduct same-sex weddings. Last year, the Episcopal Church adopted a same-sex marriage rite, allowing pastors to decide, with diocesan-wide approval from the local bishop, whether to officiate same-sex weddings. And the number of Catholics in the 113th Congress is at an all-time high. This according to data from the Pew Forum on Religion and Public Life. There are 163 Catholic members of Congress, and that's up from the previous high of 161 in the 2009-2010 cycle. That's approximately 31% of the current membership. Since the 1960s, Catholics have been the largest single religious group in Congress, though Protestants of various communities still constitute the largest percentage of members at 56%. Interestingly, 10% of congressional members are graduates of Jesuit institutions, including 11 senators and 41 members of the House. Meanwhile, President Barack Obama's pick to offer the benediction at his inauguration has dropped out after it was discovered that he had once given a sermon warning against the, quote, aggressive agenda of the gay rights movement. The liberal Think Progress blog unearthed a mid-1990s sermon of the Reverend Louis Giglio of Georgia. He said at the time, "We must lovingly but firmly respond to the aggressive agenda of many in the homosexual community." In a statement released on Thursday, Giglio said he withdrew due to concerns that his prayer would, quote, be dwarfed by those seeking to make their agenda the focal point of the inauguration. End quote. An inaugural committee spokeswoman said they're working to find a suitable replacement to deliver the benediction, one who reflects the administration's vision of inclusion and acceptance of all Americans. Meanwhile, President Obama has denounced a new freedom of conscience provision allowing military chaplains to refuse to perform same-sex marriage ceremonies. After signing the 2013 National Defense Authorization Act, this week, the president issued a statement calling the Conscience Protection Amendment unnecessary and ill-advised. The law ensures that chaplains are not forced to perform any rite, ritual, or ceremony that's contrary to their conscience, moral principles, or religious beliefs. It further prevents discrimination or the denial of promotion, training, or assignment based on a chaplain's refusal to perform such ceremonies. The Chaplain Alliance for Religious Liberty, a group of veteran chaplains, has called on the Obama administration to honor the legislation. Also, the Obama administration's funding of embryonic stem cell research will continue. This after the U.S. Supreme Court this week declined to hear a case brought by two adult stem cell researchers challenging the funding. In 2009, the National Institutes of Health effectively overturned President George W. Bush's executive order, which banned federal funds for any research on newly created embryonic stem cell lines. That same year, the plaintiffs in this case sued, arguing that such funding violated the 1996 Dickey-Wicker Amendment, which prohibited federal funding of research where human embryos are knowingly subjected to risk of injury or death. The Obama administration argued that the prohibition does not apply to the stem cells harvested from such embryos. In 2011, an appellate court ruled that the Dickey-Wicker Amendment was ambiguous on that point and allowed the funding. 40 years after the Roe v. Wade decision legalizing abortion in the U.S., a new poll is showing more support for limiting access to the procedure. According to a Knights of Columbus Marist College poll on abortion attitudes, 83% of those surveyed favored significant restrictions on abortion access. 84% of those surveyed believed laws could protect both mothers and their unborn children. 6 in 10 viewed abortion as morally wrong, and just 11% would allow abortion at any time. On Monday, a California judge ruled that the Archdiocese of Los Angeles must release the names of church leaders and priests identified in thousands of pages of internal documents recounting decades of clerical abuse allegations. Superior Court Judge Emil Elias overturned much of a 2011 ruling and a 2007 agreement between the Archdiocese and plaintiffs' attorneys that would have allowed the names of the document or in the documents to be redacted prior to their public release. Elias said the public's interest in knowing the details of abuse, which prompted the Archdiocese to agree to a record $660 million settlement with victims, outweighed the privacy rights of accused priests and others. The documents include letters and memos between top church officials and their attorneys, medical and psychological records, complaints from parents, as well as correspondence with the Vatican, 30,000 pages in toto. It's not immediately clear how soon those documents would be released. Meanwhile, on Wednesday, the Diocese of Burlington in Vermont has, for the second time in 4 years, settled clerical abuse lawsuits against it. The settlement amount for the 11 cases of alleged abuse has not been disclosed. The previous 2010 settlement of $17 million ended 26 lawsuits against the diocese. Most of the alleged abuse occurred during the 1970s by a single priest, since laicized. And finally, coming in early March, finally some good news, the producer of television Survivor and The Voice, Mark Burnett, is bringing the Bible to the History Channel. It is an epic undertaking. The 10-hour, 5-part docudrama will cover the scriptures from Genesis all the way to Revelation. Touched by an angel star, Rama Downey, who also happens to be Mrs. Burnett, plays the Virgin Mary. She co-produced and leads an international cast. Burnett says that by telling these emotionally connected big stories, hopefully, millions of people will reopen their Bibles. I had a chance to see some of this project a few weeks ago, and it is spectacular. Stay tuned in the coming weeks for my exclusive interview with Mark Burnett and Rama Downey about the Bible. When we return, we'll delve into the Pope's State of the World address. Where is religious freedom being challenged most? And where are people of faith facing the harshest persecution? Nina Shea will update us on the global hotspots when the World Over Live continues. Stay right there.
Now, once again, Raymond Arroyo.
In his annual State of the World address to the Vatican Diplomatic Corps this week, Pope Benedict ran through a list of countries he's most concerned about. He renewed his urgent call for a ceasefire in Syria. First and foremost in his thoughts, the pontiff said, is the endless slaughter and dreadful suffering of Syria's civilian population. The United Nations last week estimated that 60,000 Syrians have been killed since fighting began in 2011. Hundreds of thousands more have been displaced. The Holy Father noted other areas of conflict and persecution, including Nigeria and the Middle East. He also mentioned his dismay over efforts to introduce and expand legalized abortion in many countries, an apparent allusion to Ireland. He advised the ambassadors that a refusal to acknowledge clear moral norms is a failing, and that without openness to the transcendent, we easily become prey to relativism, make it difficult to act justly and to work for peace. Joining us to examine some of the hot spots around the world for people of faith is the director of the Center for Religious Freedom at the Hudson Institute. She's a former member of the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom. Would you welcome Nina Shea?
Great
Nina,
to be here.
Great to have you back on the show.
Thank you.
Let's talk for a moment about some of the countries the Pope identified. Starting with Nigeria, we saw 5 people killed in an attack on a church at Christmas time. Tell us what's happening there and why.
It was 2 churches that were attacked. This is, and 12 people were killed. This is by a terrorist group, we think.
Boko Haram.
Boko Haram. No one's really taken credit for those killings, but the last 2 years we've seen attacks on churches, on worshipers during Christmas. In June, I think it was almost every Sunday there were churches bombed. So there's been quite a number of attacks directly at the Christians.
What can the international community do? Let's start there.
Well, the first thing that the United States should do is recognize that it's a religiously motivated attack. This is a fundamentalist or extremist Islamic group. It has ties to al-Qaeda, and our State Department refuses to acknowledge that and instead talks about how this is because of poverty, the root causes, and therefore we must give more aid to the Muslim villages that are producing the terrorists.
Oh, gosh. And Frank Wolf has Congressman Frank Wolf, who's been a human rights and religious freedom advocate for decades. He's introduced a bill really trying to, or rather he's issued a statement trying to rally the religious community in the United States to speak out about this, just this sort of persecution. What should the churches be doing and people of faith?
Yeah, the churches, Christians in particular, should be speaking out about this, trying to raise the profile, because often when you shine the light on an incident or a situation or an arrest, there's some remedy for that's quickly found. Even in a place like Iran, where a pastor was recently released from prison, or Pakistan, where a Christian girl, Catholic girl, was released. It's so shameful, these situations, and they're so pitiful, that it's really incumbent on anyone who calls himself a Christian not to avert their eyes, but to really acknowledge what's happening.
And this gets so little coverage in the media. I mean, aside from our show and a handful of others, and little squibs you see buried on page 16 of your papers, this persecution and the state of religious freedom around the world and people being targeted for their faith goes virtually uncovered.
That's right. I mean, how many people know that 70 churches in Iraq have been bombed? Many of them while they're full of worshipers. In one case, Our Lady of Salvation, we've talked about this on your show a couple years ago, was bombed during I think it was an All Saints Day Mass, and everybody in the congregation was either killed or wounded, including 3 priests who were killed.
Let's talk for a moment about Sudan. I spoke to our friend Archbishop Gassis the other day, Bishop Gassis the other day, who was just coming back from his home diocese, and he was talking about the continued bombing happening in the Nuba Mountain region.
And we've seen this again and again in Sudan. The president of Sudan, of course, Omar Bashir, is an indicted war criminal. He did this in Darfur. He did this in the Nuba Mountains, the bishop's diocese, before, 10 years ago. He's back doing it again. And what he does is bomb the agricultural areas so that people cannot harvest their crops, they cannot farm. And then at the same time, he restricts the international community from delivering international aid. So by this method, mass starvation.
If you have a question for Nina or comment, give us a jingle. 1-800-221-9460 in the U.S. Internationally, 205-271-2980. Or you can drop us an email, worldover@EWTN.com. Let's talk for a moment about Saudi Arabia. This is something you've been writing about for a long time. I was stunned to see there is an exhibit just behind us here at the Smithsonian, Roads to Arabia. And this is sponsored by Saudi Arabia. What is the story here? Why are you so upset about this exhibit?
I'm upset about this exhibit, and I wrote about it for NRO this week because it is actually housed in the U.S. Smithsonian Institute. And the Smithsonian is government funded and controlled. Right. And this is throwing sand in our face.
Now, what do you mean by that? I saw that line.
I mean that
Saudi Arabia is
it's
throwing sand in our face.
distracting us from and blinding us to what they're really about. The exhibit is purports to show how multicultural and diverse Saudi Arabia was hundreds of years ago. Right. And it was. It was a trade route for frankincense, one of the gifts of the Magi in the Christmas story. And so people from all over the ancient world came there, and they left artifacts. Many, many, of course, are sacred images of their gods. Babylonians and Persians and the Greeks, the Romans. However, Judaism and Christianity have a very long history during antiquity in Saudi Arabia, in what is now Saudi Arabia, in the Arabian Peninsula. There was nothing that I saw from that period at all. And at the same time, they allow no churches to be built. There are no Jews left. And we know artifacts of Christian churches because one was found in the mid-'80s in the eastern area where the oil fields are. And the government cordoned it off, won't let anyone visit, and that was not part of the show. So this is really a mirage that Saudi Arabia, and actually the curator of the show, who's a Saudi, was quoted in the brochure for the exhibition saying, Saudi Arabia has been open. We have always been open. We are open now. And it's false. They're one of the worst persecutors, religious persecutors in the world, and I think that there's a general agreement about that.
Yeah, I mean, you can't bring a Bible in, you can't pray the rosary in public. I mean, there are
no priests that dare show themselves. There may be some hidden. Even Santa Claus was arrested one year, escaping through a window, escaping from the religious police when he showed up at the American school. I mean, it's just an Italian. I mean, it goes to absurd levels to suppress Christianity. An Italian soccer, I think it was a Milano soccer team came and they had a cross on their jersey. That was their logo. The Saudis made them blot it out, the crossbar, so it was just a stroke. I mean, it gets to the point of ridiculousness, but it's not. It's very serious.
Any
People
government
go to
that would arrest St. Nicholas, you know, we got a problem on our hands. Now, you say in your article that your real problem is they're exporting this sort of intolerance toward people of other faiths, anything but Islam, to other Muslim countries. How so? How are they doing that?
Well, one of the key ways is through their textbooks and through their educational materials. And that's really been the heart of my research on Saudi Arabia. And I've done many reports analyzing, getting translated and analyzing their textbooks. And the most recent ones, which they're now boasting have been revised, once again, they say this periodically, actually talks about how the Jews are untrustworthy and that they can't be held to their promises and you can't trust them in a contract. And then the Christians have to be suppressed or else they cannot be tolerated. They must be killed in Muslim lands. And Christians and Jews together cannot live in Dar al-Islam, the place of the abode of Islam. So this is their message. They're sending it around the world. They put it on the internet. I give in my piece the website for these textbooks. Anyone can download
These
them.
are official textbooks.
These are Ministry of Education, Saudi Ministry of Education textbooks that's required for all the schools, not just the public ones actually, in Saudi Arabia. But even worse, aside from the 5 million students that they educate, you have the whole Muslim world downloading them.
But you have an incredibly wealthy oil-producing country, and though they are considered an ally of the United States, the United States has very little leverage here, do they?
Well, I think the United States can speak to them about it, and they've pretended that they've too quickly taken their word at face value that they've revised the textbooks, because these are in Arabic, of course. Somebody has to translate them. But if my little operation, I don't have a big staff, staff about 4 people, can do this, the United States government can. And they need to, and they need to really take them to task to say, because we've done that with the terrorist financing, and there's been some progress there. But even the head of the Treasury Finance Department, Stuart Levy, has written in the Washington Post that if we don't get the education reformed, we're never going to see the end of these terrorists, because the kindling, Jim Woolsey, head of the CIA, formerly, called it the kindling for bin Laden's match. He's written that about the textbooks.
These textbooks, yeah, they sort of fuel this Islamist mindset.
Yes, and you have to. Everybody has to understand that Saudi Arabia is not only wealthy and rich from oil doing this, has a capability, but it also, as the custodian of the 2 holiest shrines in Islam, has a lot of clout in the Muslim world. So other countries look to Saudi Arabia.
Let's talk for a moment about Egypt. You've got 8 to 10 million Copts there, who are really Coptic Christians, who are really right on the edge. As this new constitution has been promulgated and written, they left the process. The Copt leaders walked away, Catholic leaders walked away, even some of the secular representatives simply walked away from the table. What is the state of religious freedom and faith now in Egypt under in the post-Egypt Spring, Arabic Spring period?
That's a good question. We don't quite know. Things are in flux. There is a very repressive military dictatorship under Mubarak, who applied not only repressive laws for political reasons against everybody, but also targeted Christians under some leftover Ottoman laws, like that you can't build churches without government permission.
You can't reform. Yeah, you can't refurbish the churches.
You can't even restore them at all. Yeah. But now, and then you went through a chaotic period of the Arab Spring Revolution when the Christians were initially supportive and they were actually hopeful. And then things started turning sour, and their churches started burning. They protested. They were killed for protesting the church burnings. And now it's a period where they're terrified and leaving. And Sam Tadros is a Coptic analyst and expert from Egypt who works with me at the Center for Religious Freedom at Hudson. He just got back from Egypt. He said, people are leaving. Everybody is leaving. They're leaving for if they're wealthy, they're buying homes in Europe, in Cyprus, in Spain. The churches here, Coptic churches in the United States and Canada, are reporting influx of thousands of new members from Egypt. So anybody who has a visa or can come in any way, shape, or form is trying to make plans among the Copts to get out, which is just very tragic.
Now the leader of the Coptic Catholics in Egypt is on record as saying, and I quote, that this new constitution prepares the way for an Islamic caliphate and undermines the rights of Christians in the region and Jews in the region, etc. What is at stake here? What does that mean? Decode that for our audience.
He's absolutely right. What the Constitution says is that Al-Azhar, the Sunni religious center in Cairo, determines whether laws should stand or not, whether they're compatible with Islam. That is one of the measures under this Constitution. There's a blasphemy law in the Constitution. It's the only country in the world, I think, that has a blasphemy law right in their Constitution. And then Sam Tadros has pointed out to me that there's a provision in the Constitution, and this went unnoticed in the press, that takes control, that allows the government to take control of the church finances. So it's going to take over the Coptic Church on the sort of Soviet model where the government takes over the church, except the government in this case is an Islamic system. So the Copts are really in a very difficult place right now.
And then there's this Article 219, which outlines Sharia principles and enshrines them within the Constitution, meaning everybody will be subject to Sharia law.
Yes,
they believe this will erode whatever religious freedoms are carved out earlier in the Constitution in Article 3.
Yeah, it'll undermine and negate the Bill of Rights. And it subjects all the, that Article 2 was in the Constitution previously. But this time it's different because the Bill of Rights is actually conditioned on, well, you have freedom of expression so long as it doesn't conflict with Sharia. You have women's equality so long as it doesn't conflict with Sharia.
And what practically will that mean for Copts? Women have to wear the headscarves. They have to restrict themselves to certain places.
They will have to abide by Sharia law, and they will. Yes, eventually, if you take a look at Saudi Arabia, that may be where it's headed, or Iran. Where there's no, in Saudi Arabia, no commingling of the sexes. Women can't work.
But, it's a country we give billions of dollars in aid to.
Yeah.
Surely the United States has some influence in the region, or do we?
We should. We not only give the money for that was arranged with the Camp David Accords, a couple billion, but they have $2 billion of debt that we're in the process of forgiving, which I don't understand. We have our own debt issues here. Why are we forgiving their debt? And then we're supporting about $8 billion of IMF loans for Egypt. So altogether, we're responsible for 10, 11, upwards billion dollars this year. And we really should be using some of that for better leverage.
We should draw some human rights protection.
We need to draw a red line for the protection of the Copts and for their full rights, not just their protection, not that they just won't be killed, which is a real issue, a real fear, but that their rights, their property rights, their rights to freedom, their rights to work, their rights to live out their faith are protected.
Just this week, and you brought up Iraq in passing, and I want to dwell on it for a moment. Just this week, we saw a teacher, her throat slit in Mosul, a Christian teacher. January 8th, Christian university student was killed by a car bomb. Christian families are beginning to, quote, lose confidence in everything, according to local officials. Again, what can we do here, and what does this tell us? This has been going on since our first incursion into Iraq.
That's right. And the Christian population has sunk from about two-thirds. Two-thirds have fled. Some of them have been killed, but mostly it's targeted killings, and everybody else flees because there's no protection for them. And I'm not sure there's anything we can do at this point for Iraq. We could help, you know, in the Kurdish area, maybe we have some leverage there. But what's frightening, Raymond, is that there are 4 countries of significant Christian population in the Middle East. Egypt is the largest, you pointed that out, right. 8 million or so. Then comes Lebanon, which right now is quiet, and then Iraq. And those people have been decimated, I mean, through immigration, through forced immigration. Right. And then Syria. So Syria's the 4th. And many of the Iraqi Christians went to Syria for refuge. And now they are, you know, I was just reading today in the Catholic press, Fides, that there's a village of Christian, the entire Christian village north of Aleppo that is isolated, about 1,000 of them. And they are been cut off, completely cut off, have no food. There's a battle going on around them between the rebel forces and the government. They have no fuel, they have no electricity. There's a Franciscan monk that's trying to help them and has come out to the world and said, please help them. They're going to be extinguished. They're going to be killed.
We're getting a lot of emails. I want to share a few of these with you before we run out of time. They're asking about, it says, dear sir, this is Joffrey, and he's asking any updates in regards to the religious persecution in Sri Lanka. Have you been following that at all?
You know, I really haven't. I have not seen it. I checked the Asian press today. Maybe he knows more than I do at this point, but I did not see anything. I mean, we are concerned with Vietnam, where 13 Christians, Catholics, were put on trial and sentenced from 3 to 13 years today for human rights work, for speaking out on behalf of others who are in prison, or for you know, church lands or Christian lands that have been taken unfairly. So that was a very hard situation. And then, of course, we keep our eye on China. And Bishop Ma from Shanghai is still under house arrest. And it is unbelievable. So
how long has he been there? That's been going on for.
Well, Bishop Ma was this summer when he was ordained. His ordination, but then there's Bishop Su, you may be thinking of, who's been there for 15 years, and we don't know where he is. And then, of course, the #1 persecutor of all time is North Korea. And that's at the very top of the list. And it's the very top of the Open Doors list, yes, that came out recently.
And what's happening there?
Well, there's actually no priest, no free church. There are 4 churches, or 4 or 5 churches, all in the capital, all government-controlled, all Potemkin villages, basically. Christians who are caught praying are imprisoned in detention camps. Not only are they imprisoned, but their children and grandchildren, 3 generations, grow up in these detention camps at near starvation levels. So it's you can be shot. We have cases of women shot in the head for possessing a Bible.
Yeah. People don't realize the intensity and severity of what's happening around the world by simply attempting to use their faith. And yet, as the Pope pointed out, here in the United States and in the West, throughout Europe, we have this almost obsession with tolerance. And he said this, the rights are exaggerated. The rights are confused with exaggerated manifestations of the autonomy of the individual, absorbed only in seeking to satisfy his own needs. And it is that sort of, you know, we've got this relativism and the secularism that's set in the West, and we really don't appreciate what people, brothers and sisters in faith abroad, are going through.
Exactly. Exactly.
I mean, it's terrifying. Really. Somebody's asking, why is there so little mainstream media interest in this topic? Why do they ignore this religious persecution going on?
Well, I think it's because they are biased against Christians. I don't think there's a lot of sympathy. I think that a lot of the media that I've encountered, not you, Raymond, not the world over, that's why we need you, is that basically Christians are the persecutors and not the persecuted. And so there's
and this obstructs and breaks that narrative.
Yes.
Which is one that the West, in the West, we
and
hear
also
a great
that
deal
Christians are white and, you know, and first world and everybody else is, you know, oppressed by them. In fact, we're rapidly seeing the Christian demographic shift so that the third world, you know, the developing world, the Brazils and the Nigerias are the big, and China's. Is the face of the Christians today.
And increasingly a persecuted face.
Very persecuted.
Where is the next hot spot that you think is emerging now? A country that perhaps in the past you didn't give much attention to, but you see ripples of intolerance toward people of faith.
Yeah, well, other than the ones that we've already spoken about, I'd say, you know, Mali, I'm very concerned about other countries, particularly Muslim countries, where the Salafi, this Islamism, the political Islamist movement is on the rise. And Mali, of course, and places like Somalia are just being taken over by extremist Islamic groups.
And much of your work, I know, particularly when you were on the Commission for International Religious Freedom, it was trying to rally the government, the State Department, to engage on these issues. All these years later, do you see any sense that the State Department has an awareness of this, or have we really lost ground in this area?
Well, one thing that we've, just one little glimmer of hope, I mean, it is a bleak picture, and there is not a lot of policy. And, you know, another example is Tanzania, where a priest was shot after Mass in October, I believe. Oh, no, at Christmas. And then others were threatened with beheading in, you know, in October there. So that's another place, another example of Africa just growing intolerance that's spreading from Northern Africa and the Middle East. You know, the State Department is horrific when it comes to policy. They don't acknowledge it, that it's going on. But there is a book that they produce, a report that they produce every year that's actually pretty good. It's pretty good on most countries, maybe not on the West.
And it points out the offending countries and the countries
it's just the problem with it is that it is so good. It's a welter of detail, and it gets lost. Most of the press ignore it now. Maybe there's one or two headlines. But you go a little bit more deeply into it, Raymond, even throughout the year. But you know, for the most of the press, it's a one headline thing, and this is a report that's 1,000 or more pages long.
But it should be a part of our policy and the diplomatic outreach to these countries. It should be first and foremost. It's human rights. It's basic human freedoms. It's
basic human rights. The one thing that the report does do, and that's why I think it is a success, and we shouldn't ignore it, it's a gold standard in many ways on human rights reporting. It's on the internet. And it forces our diplomats in our embassies to go out and meet the different religious groups, particularly the minorities. And that's important.
Which is never a bad thing. Nina Shea, thank you for being here.
Thank you.
To follow the Hudson Institute Center for Religious Freedom and to read Nina's columns, visit hudson.org. Up next, Congresswoman DIANE BLACK is here to talk about her bill to end federal funding of Planned Parenthood. The World Over Live continues in a moment. Stay right there.
Now, once again, Raymond Arroyo.
Welcome back to The World Over Live. The budget and how much the federal government spends has been on the minds of many here in Washington. This week, a beneficiary of some $542 million of government funds each year, Planned Parenthood, released their annual report. In this last year, according to that report, they performed nearly 334,000 abortions, an all-time high. Given the staggering statistics and the pressures on Congress to cut spending, my next guest believes Planned Parenthood should be defunded. She's the representative for Tennessee's 6th District and sponsor of a bill to strip Planned Parenthood of federal funds. Joining me via satellite from Nashville is Congresswoman DIANE BLACK. Congresswoman, thanks for being with us.
Oh, you're so welcome. It's my honor to be with you.
Now, let's talk for a moment about this bill. This is part of Title X, which is via the Health and Human Services Department. It is funding to help with family planning. What's the problem with these monies going to Planned Parenthood?
Well, because Planned Parenthood's major mission is abortions, and family planning dollars are to go for health care, and abortions are hardly health care. But if you read what the funds are really supposed to be used for, it's supposed to be for healthy families, and hardly is that the definition of a healthy family when you're having so many abortions. Actually, 92% of their family planning is abortions. Only 8% is prenatal care and any kind of counseling to have adoptions. So you can see that that money is being used in a way that's not the intended purpose.
Congresswoman Black, I want to play you a little bite. This is Cecile Richards, the president of Planned Parenthood. Now, this is a bite from 2011 when there was another bill, when Mike Pence's bill was in the House, to do exactly what your bill would do, defund Planned Parenthood. Listen to her response should this bill become law.
What's going to happen as a result of this, if this bill ever becomes law, millions of women in this country are going to lose their health care access, not to abortion services, to basic family planning, you know, mammograms, cancer screenings,
all
cervical
the things
cancer,
that women need and people can't afford.
Exactly. That's the irony of this, is that we just spent this last year talking about the need to get more people health care coverage. Millions of women now would have absolutely no health care coverage in this country and nowhere to go.
So, Congresswoman, Planned Parenthood's position is that this is health care. They provide mammograms, cancer screenings, and abortion is only a small part of their business. Why defund those efforts?
Well, first of all, that is a misnomer, because we know that 92% of what they do in their clinic is abortions. Now, here's the other thing that they try to say is that those who are low income and least can afford health care will not have health care, and that is not so. As a matter of fact, when I was here at the state of Tennessee, in the state Senate, we looked at other providers that could provide those very same services outside of the abortions, but true health care. And what we found is that there are federal and state health departments, there are community health clinics, there are faith-based clinics that provide these very same services. And what they said to me is, we'd love to have the money, but all that money goes to Planned Parenthood. So that's a real ruse, and it's a weak argument because it's not true at all.
Now, you were a nurse for 40 years, right?
That's right. I'm still a nurse, and I have been a nurse for over 40 years protecting life.
Now, Planned Parenthood says, look, the Title X monies are segregated. None of the monies the federal government grants, indeed the law says, they can't spend those federal funds providing abortions. So isn't your law a little off base here? Well,
here's where you have to question this. First of all, the clinics have on one side of the clinic what they consider to be health care. And again, we know that there's only 8% of their mission that really goes to health care. And then on the other side, they're providing abortion. So how do you determine who's paying for the lights and the heat and the administrative costs when they're in the same building? And most interesting is that just this year, they're requiring all of their clinics, the clinics that are providing just health care right now, they're requiring that they all would provide abortion services. Does that not make you question about what their true mission is? Their #1 mission is abortions. And when they have abortions on one side and what they consider to be health care on the other side, we know that there is money that is supplanting what the costs are of those abortions.
So your contention is that administrative costs and the electricity and things basic to the operation are probably being paid via these federal funds and therefore indirectly supporting the abortion business.
That's right. Well, we know that almost 50% of their dollars that take to operate are coming from federal dollars through Title X. So we know that that money is being used in those clinics. As I say, on one side to do one thing, on the other side, behind the other curtain, they're doing another. And it is supplanting the money for their major mission, which is abortions.
How does the admission that we discovered this week, the sheer number of abortions being provided by Planned Parenthood, how do you think that affects the success or probability of your bill passing? one abortion every 94 seconds via Planned Parenthood. That's 1 million abortions over 3 years.
When we find that, and I found this in the state of Tennessee when I served in the legislature here, and we talked about the money that was going to Planned Parenthood, and we found other clinics that were willing to do those services. They just couldn't get the same Title X funding and grant money that Planned Parenthood did. We know those services are there and can be provided by others. And again, it's just a ruse when they say that these services are not going to be provided by any other provider.
And indeed, mammograms, they don't provide mammograms. They simply refer women to clinics that do provide those services.
That's right.
Let's
talk. And then the most
ahead.
recent report also, I just want to say the most recent report showed that what they have been claiming to do in health care has been decreasing every year, and by a pretty significant amount. So we see abortions increasing, but we see the health care that they're providing, the ones, the cancer screenings and those kinds of things, are decreasing.
Let's talk for a moment about the response to your bill moving through the House. Some of Planned Parenthood supporters, indeed Planned Parenthood itself, says you are part of the GOP's continuing war on women. You would say what?
I'd say the greatest war on women is when you don't give women information, good information, and you walk into a clinic and most of what they're getting in there is abortions rather than prenatal care and counseling in those cases where perhaps an adoption may be a better option for a woman. That's a war on women. And when the money that we should be using for health care is going for abortions, that is not health care. That's a war on women. And you know the other great issue about war on women, let's see how many of those babies would have been girls that could have grown up and been productive citizens of this society. That's a war on women.
Some of the data from their report in 2011, abortions made up 92% of Planned Parenthood's pregnancy services, while prenatal care and adoption referrals accounted for 7%. What does that tell you?
Well, that tells me that they claim that they give health care there, and yet we see that the major mission of Planned Parenthood, we've seen this over and over again through the years, and you know, the more we talk about this and the more the public understands it, the more pressure will be put upon our legislators to make sure that that money that really is there for health care will be given to those clinics that are providing health care.
Who's supporting this bill, Congresswoman? And tell me about, there's a bill that's identical that your colleague, Congresswoman Marsha Blackburn, introduced to Congress. Why the same bill introduced twice?
Well, let me first of all say that I'm very proud to carry on the legacy of Representative Pence, who has carried this legislation for a number of years. I also want to say that we were successful in the House, not last year, but the year before, on our continuing resolution. It was my amendment. It actually was the first bill that I passed to defund Planned Parenthood. It actually passed the House. It went to the Senate, and it failed in the Senate. But we're not going to give up. And the more people that we have talking about that, my colleague Marsha Blackburn talking about it, the better off we are. Because the more we can talk to the public and help them understand that their taxpayer dollars are being used to supplant the services of Planned Parenthood in doing abortions, which is their primary mission, the more that the public will once again call their legislators and say, hey, get on board here. There should be no money going to any organization, Planned Parenthood obviously being the one that gets the greatest amount of that money, $500 million every year. The more pressure will be put upon legislators to do the right thing, and that is to make sure that money goes to those organizations that are truly doing health care and not abortions.
Congresswoman DIANE BLACK, who we're speaking with from Tennessee. Congresswoman, what is the likelihood that this bill will pass? I mean, aside from inserting language into an omnibus budget, you know, and having it sort of slip through in the dead of night, what is the real possibility of this getting through the Senate, much less receiving the president's signature?
Well, we have over 70 sponsors in the House right now. We're continuing to build. I think we're up to like 78 sponsors. We have a lot of organizations that are our coalition outside of the legislature that is helping us with this bill to make sure that the public knows about it, so that they will call their legislators and let them know what they want them to do. So we're very proud of that. We're going to continue to march forward. I think we're going to have success again in the House. And we hope that, again, there'll be pressure put upon the senators to make sure that they're doing the right thing, and that is making sure this money goes to the proper place.
Congresswoman, you are a member of the Ways and Means and the Budget Committee. You voted against the fiscal cliff deal. Why?
Well, I really feel that that bill did nothing to address the root of our fiscal problem. We have an out-of-control spending in this country, and to have raised more revenue but not talk about the other side of that, and that is getting our house in order, where we continue to spend $1 trillion more every year than what we bring in. We've got a spending crisis in this country, and we have got to address it, because we talk about this fiscal cliff, but if we don't address this fiscal issue, $16 trillion in debt, we're going to have a much larger fiscal cliff in years to come, where we continue to grow our deficit spending and therefore our debt. And so I want honest conversation about our problem that we have with spending here in this country.
Congresswoman, some of your colleagues say they're keeping their eye on the debt ceiling. You have to raise the debt ceiling in the next few weeks here. They see that as a proper arena to have this fight over spending cuts. Do you agree that that's the time to have the fight and over the raising of the debt ceiling?
I do agree, because I think that's where you get the negotiations, where you can say, okay, if this needs to be done, then this needs to be done. And it's a way to get the conversation going and put pressure on those who just feel that we every year continue to put another $1 trillion on the credit card. If that's where you want to go, then let's talk about how we can get that spending under control. And I think that this is the time to have that conversation.
What do you make of,
at the very least, a 1-for-1?
What do you make of former Speaker Newt Gingrich's assertion, which he made last week? He said, look, the debt ceiling's not the time to have this fight. You're holding global markets hostage, and you could destabilize them by not raising the debt limit. Wait till you have a continuing resolution to spend more money, or the sequestration, which automatic cuts will kick in a moment. Why aren't those a better time to have this argument and this fight?
Well, and I appreciate former Speaker of the House, Newt Gingrich. He's a very bright man. He certainly served the Congress well in trying to make sure that, excuse me, there was a seriousness about our spending here in this country. And I appreciate that. But I will tell you that every opportunity that we have to have that discussion and to put the pressure on those who want to continue to spend and not cut, we need to take that opportunity. And I believe that every opportunity we should be talking about getting spending under control here in our country.
Congresswoman, the Reverend Louis Giglio was chosen by the President to pronounce the benediction at his inauguration. As a result of what is being described as an anti-gay sermon he gave almost 20 years ago, he has withdrawn from that role. Your thoughts on his withdrawal and what this means to sort of the freedom, I suppose, for people of faith to speak out on these delicate social issues?
Well, I know that a number of people feel that that is not the arena to be speaking about social issues, but I believe that what we do in Congress really sets the stage, the public policy for what happens in the rest of the country. And we have a marriage defense amendment to our in our legislation, in our federal legislation, and I believe that defense of marriage needs to stay there. And this is an issue that we do need to discuss at the federal level. We are a country that was founded upon Christian principles, and I believe strongly that the legislature does have a role in setting those policies for our country. And that, look, it all comes down to family and keeping the family strong. That's the fabric of our society. And when we start pulling that fabric of our society apart, we see things happening such as what's happening all around the country now with the family dissolving and not staying strong. Healthy families create healthy communities, and healthy communities create a strong country.
Congresswoman DIANE BLACK, we hope you'll come back. Thanks so much for being here.
Thank you for having me this evening.
That is all the time we have. The show continues on Facebook and Twitter. Go to RaymondArroyo.com. The Twitter and Facebook pages are linked on the left-hand side of the site. Like me on Facebook or follow me on Twitter at Raymond Arroyo. Part of what we want to do this year is bring you inspirational stories of faith and courage that perhaps we haven't heard about. If you know of one, send me an email, and maybe we'll feature it in an upcoming program. You can reach me at Raymond@RaymondArroyo.com. EWTN.com. Next week, film director Tim Watkins will be here to discuss his new documentary on Our Lady of Guadalupe. The Blood and the Rose, it's called. On behalf of the staff and crew of EWTN News, I'm Raymond Arroyo. We'll see you next time. Bye now.